Freedom changed for different groups of Americans during the Civil War. Before the Civil War, only white men were truly free, despite the fact that America was founded on the ideal that all men are created equal. The South felt that by losing the ability to own slaves, they were losing the freedom to own property. The North believed that by freeing slaves, African Americans were gaining their freedom. The federal government gained freedom because they could give power to the people instead of the states. After the Civil War, all men had the right to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, including African Americans. The invention of the cotton gin, the Emancipation Proclamation, and Sherman's March to the Sea contributed to the change in the meaning of freedom by changing the way Americans viewed and treated slaves.
Welcome to American News, Civil War Special.
Tonight, we will be discussing how different ideas about freedom tore our country apart and how it changed the meaning of freedom in America before, after, and during the Civil War.
Freedom changed for individuals because slaves were no longer considered property and people could no longer be bought or sold. Many Southerners felt they lost this freedom because they could no longer own slaves. States lost freedom because the 10th Amendment lost its power. The 10th Amendment lost its power because the Constitution did not directly give the federal government the power to ban slavery in all the states. But they did anyways. The federal government gained freedom and power because they now guaranteed freedom to the citizens instead of the states guaranteeing freedom. This is the type of government Alexander Hamilton wanted.
Advances in technology and major events had huge effects on the outcome of the war.
These advances and major events gave significant advantages to both the North and the South. Benefits for the North included more and better railroad and ships.
The South could use their immense cotton industry as a weapon by refusing to trade with the North and therefore hurt their economy. This is also known as cotton diplomacy.
The cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, revolutionizing the cotton industry. The machine made seed removal much faster and made cotton very profitable in the South. Because cotton was now so profitable, slavery became an essential component in the Southern lifestyle. In 1790, there were estimated 700,000 slaves by 1810, and there were 1.2 million slaves in the U.S.
Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin revolutionized the cotton industry in the United States. Prior to his invention, farming cotton required hundreds of man-hours to separate the cotton seeds from the raw cotton fibers. Simple seed-removing devices have been around for centuries. However, Eli Whitney's invention automated the seed separation process. His machine could generate up to 50 pounds of clean cotton daily, making cotton production profitable for the southern states.
This affected the war because it enslaved so many more people. This meant that more slaves were escaping the North, leading to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The act required the slaves that escaped the North to be returned south by law. This quote shows some of the controversy about the Fugitive Slave Act between the North and South. I confess I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down, but I bite my lip and keep quiet. And this shows Lincoln's views on the act. Many Northerners refused to capture and return their slaves, which angered the South. This all happened before South Carolina seceded in December of 1860, but was a huge reason why they seceded.
President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862. At this point, the nation was approaching its third year of the bloody Civil War. The proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforth shall be free. The Emancipation Proclamation applied only to states that had seceded from the Union, leaving slavery untouched in the border states. It also exempted the parts of the Confederacy that were already under Union control. Lincoln felt he could finally issue the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd because the Union had just had a big victory at Antietam.
Most Northern anti-slave leaders praised the Emancipation Proclamation. They had waited a long time for such a document. But some did not like it. They said it did not go far enough. It did not free all of the slaves in the United States, only those held by the rebels. Lincoln agreed that all slaves should be freed, but he did not believe that the Constitution gave him the power to free all the slaves. He made the proclamation in his wartime powers as commander-in-chief, so it was only legal to free the slaves in enemy territory.
Many Northern newspapers praised Lincoln. For example, Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, which had earlier criticized Lincoln on the subject, printed "God bless Abraham Lincoln" on the front page in bold. Other newspapers, like the Boston Gazette, were happy about the proclamation, but reminded readers that the proclamation was just a formality and the slaves had not yet been physically freed.
Many people in the South felt the Emancipation Proclamation directly threatened their way of life because it promised freedom to the slaves in Confederate states that did not rejoin the Union by January 1st, 1863. President Lincoln hoped the Emancipation Proclamation would cripple the Confederacy, since the Confederate states were using slaves to help with the war effort.
This photo was published in Southern Illustrated News on November 8, 1862, as a reaction to President Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. The cartoon reveals what many Southerners thought of Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. The depiction of Lincoln as a devil with the mask illustrates how many Southerners viewed Lincoln.
Sherman's March to the Sea began on November 15, 1864, when Sherman and his troops left Atlanta, Georgia. The march concluded on December 21, 1864, when Sherman and his troops arrived in Savannah. They destroyed everything in their path. Livestock, houses, weapons, railroads, and anything of use to the Confederates was burned to the ground.
Joining us today, we have a veteran from the Union Army here to tell us what really happened during Sherman's March to Sea. Hello, Leo James.
Thank you so much for having me here today.
So, tell me, what was destroyed when you arrived at Savannah?
Well, the original plan was to only burn items that could be useful to the Confederate Army, but almost everything was destroyed. But we only took from the rich and hostile, not the poor and neutral.
So how many people participated in Sherman's March to Sea?
About 60,000 Union troops.
I had no idea that many people had participated.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing with us your experiences during the Civil War.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Our next question is, how did the Confederates react to this? Here live, we have John Doe, a veteran from the Confederate Army. How are you, John Doe?
I'm great.
Care to share your opinion on the topic?
This was a tragic Confederate loss. We responded by trying to invade Tennessee so Sherman would be forced to follow. Unfortunately, he didn't fall for it and traveled north instead.
Thank you for speaking with us today, John Doe.
Of course.
Now back to the studio. The telegraph had a huge effect on the Civil War. In 1828, the first telegraph in the USA was invented by Harrison Dare. He sent electrical sparks through chemically treated paper to burn dots and dashes. It was later adapted to create electronic messages. Of course, messengers could have carried these back and forth, but the immediacy of the electronic messages put the president in his general's tent, capable of back and forth exchange almost as if he were physically present. The telegraph wire became a way for the president to stay informed and assert himself. The telegraph also helped spread news quickly throughout the nation. News of important events, like the Emancipation Proclamation, could be spread through the nation within a few hours. This was revolutionary at the time.
Samuel Morse invented the most commonly referred to type of telegraph. He proved that signals could be transmitted by wire. He used pulses of a current to deflect an electromagnet, which moved a marker to produce written codes on a strip of paper, the invention of Morse code. The following year, the device was modified to emboss the paper with dots and dashes. He gave a public demonstration in 1838, but it was not until 5 years later that Congress funded $30,000 to construct an experimental telegraph line from Washington to Baltimore, a distance of 40 miles. The Western Union built its first transcontinental telegraph line in 1861.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you next time on American News.
Have a great evening.
Oh my god.
Joining us today, we have a veteran from the Union Army to share with us what really happened.
I saw it.
That was my nose.